Author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
In the classic dystopian novel Fahrenheit 451, the fire chief, Beatty, he attempts to make the hero of the tale understand why book burning has become the accepted form. He says, if you don't want a man unhappy politically, don't give him two sides of a question to worry him. Give him one. Better yet, give him none. His point being that if the questions are not even asked, then the blinded man does not even know there is a question to be asked. And it seems we're fast approaching this point in modern politics. Ask a question and prepare for the incoming. Don't question the orthodoxy of the progressive worldview. Don't consider how science can ever truly be settled. If you do, you may be risking more than you know. Welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. And on today's show, we talk about the mind of the mass shooter, failures in White House communication, impeaching a Supreme Court justice, and a whole lot more besides. I want to take a moment to say a special thank you to our listeners out in Evergreen, Alabama on WNWF 1470 AM and WPNS on 1140 AM. Thank you for being here. Remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com. You can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. As Democrats seek new measures to curb the Second Amendment rights of law-abiding Americans in response to recent mass shooting events, it seems the blame, as always, falls on inanimate objects, guns. But is the answer to preventing these tragedies perhaps far more controversial? Well, we're fortunate to be joined by Liberty Nation's editor-in-chief, Lisa K. Donner, who recently wrote a hugely popular article on where folks maybe should be looking for answers. Thanks for coming on, Lisa.
Good to be here, Mark.
So, Lisa, in your article, you discuss a connection that's I'd say it's being widely ignored in favor of the narrative that guns are responsible for violence. What's your suggestion?
Well, we keep looking in the same place over and over again, expecting a different result, and we know that doesn't work. But anyway, an extraordinary number of these boys are taking these psychiatric medications known as selective serotonin uptake inhibitors, also known as SSRIs. You know, and it's at least worth exploring, Mark, whether there's a connection between the high level of SSRI usage in these shooters and their homicidal behaviors.
Yeah, these SSRIs, you provide the numbers that back up a clear correlation. But I think the main point of your article that everybody should go over to LibertyNation.com and read is that people just aren't studying the correlation here to see if there is actually a causation factor. Now, isn't that just bad science and therefore bad policy in terms of trying to ban guns?
Well, it could be. I mean, let's think about this, Mark. What are psychiatric drugs meant to do? Let me just ask you that question.
They're meant to alleviate the symptoms of a psychiatric disorder, presumably.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. They're meant to alter one's behavior. So, of course, they're not designed to produce homicidal maniacs. But, you know, if you correlate the high incidence of SSRI usage in these youngsters, you can't ignore it. You have to take a look at the numbers, and the numbers are staggering. First of all, SSRI usage in America it's exploded in the last 20 years. 1 in 6 Americans are using some sort of antidepressant. And that includes a great number of kids. Now, let's take a minute and just so people don't think I'm crazy and making this up, let's look at the number of shooters. Here's just a few. Eric Harris, the Columbine shooter, was taking Zoloft and Luvox. 15-year-old Kip Cannell was on Prozac. He murdered his parents, went into his high school, killed 2 students, wounded 25 more. Jeff Weiss was 16 when he killed his grandfather and 9 other people before taking his own life. Then there was Dylan Roof. You remember him. He shot up the church in Charleston, South Carolina. He was on SSRIs. So were Stephen Kamerzak, James Holmes, Aaron Alexic, Sung Hao Cho, the Virginia Tech shooter. All mass shooters on some form of antidepressants. In fact, if you buzz around the web, a guy by the name of Jerome London categorized 39 mass shooters all taking SSRIs. This seems like an odd coincidence that at least deserves a discussion.
It does seem that nobody wants to address any other possible causes other than the prevalence of guns in society. Why are the left specifically, I think we should be looking at here, why are the left focusing all their attention on what is essentially just an inanimate object, rather than perhaps looking, as you're saying, looking at different data points that could be an explanation for the reason to create these homicidal tendencies?
Honestly, I think it's really sad, Mark, that they're taking this and making these horrible crimes into a political issue. They're using it to, try to make handguns or AR-15s or whatever firearm that's being used. They're using it for their own political purposes. And there could be many other reasons why these mass shootings are going on. Is there something happening in the educational environment? Are these kids abruptly stopping their medications? These are powerful mind-altering drugs. They aren't meant to be stopped. And, young people may be very cavalier with what's in their medicine cabinet. I don't feel like it today. I don't feel like taking it. I don't want to take it. And this causes lots of adverse effects. I mean, it says right on the label, warning, increased agitation, irritability, mania, impulsiveness, aggressiveness, hostility. Wow. Those are some things that we should pay attention to, don't you think?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, it does strike me, the point you make here about stopping the medication abruptly. So what happens is they're being treated as adults in terms of somebody prescribes them a drug that they're then expected to monitor and to take. And presumably they also have other effects that perhaps it makes the taker feel sluggish, doesn't make them feel like themselves anymore. And of course, as a teenager, you're always in that position anyway. You never really feel like yourself until you become the person that you are. And then to feel as though you're beholden to a drug that's been given to you by somebody in authority, the odds of people just ditching their medication for a day or 2 days, it's almost inevitable, isn't it, Lisa?
Well, not only that, but I'm not a doctor, but I don't know of any pediatric versions of these medicines. I don't know that there's an adolescent version of Zoloft or Prozac or, any of these other SSRIs. I think they were probably meant for adults and they're being used widely on adolescents. And this is just something that deserves a further examination.
Yeah, I don't think anybody's really willing to look into that, to be honest with you, Lisa.
Yeah, it takes too much time or effort. It's easier just to go up on the hill and, ban guns and expecting a different result. Let's face it, many of these kids, Mark, are displaying suicidal tendencies. A lot of them kill themselves after they go on their rampage. This is kind of a nihilistic view of the world. And it's, their social media profiles are filled with, threats and rage and anger, inability to, communicate and get along with parents and peers. It's a mess, but we just can't ignore that an extraordinary number of these young men are taking SSRIs.
Lisa K. Dunner, we'll be back talking about the mind of those young men very, very shortly, right after this break. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back on Liberty Nation Radio, speaking with Liberty Nation's Editor-in-Chief, Lisa K. Donner. Now, in the last segment, we discussed the correlation between mass shooters and SSRIs. But now I want to dive a little more into the mind of school shooters and the disaster of the gun debate. Lisa, you've done a lot of research on the kind of person responsible for these school shootings. What's the profile?
Well, the demographics are interesting. They're almost exclusively white males. Some of them are as young as 12 and 13 years old, but the average age of a school shooter is 17. That's really young. These are challenging teenage years. And, there's a lot of isolation going on with the pandemic. And who knows if that's exacerbated the situation.
It certainly seems likely, doesn't it? Added pressure on the pressure of already being a youngster. Now, you wrote in an article on this particular topic where you examined the mind and the motivations of school shooters specifically. And you wrote that they see themselves as kings. And what does that mean?
Well, to a man, and I think we can safely say that to a boy or young man, because I don't even know of any perpetrator that is female. They're, again, almost always male, white male, average age 17. And, statistics show most of these boys come from homes where the father isn't present, and part of the problem, I think, in development when you don't have a father is you're always looking to make a connection. And if you're a loner, you're isolated, you don't have any friends, you can't really talk to your mom about things that you might want to talk to a male about. It can be very, very psychologically challenging, especially the teenage years are hard. I mean, I don't know anybody that had great teenage years. I certainly didn't.
Yeah, and the teenage years themselves are a rite of passage, and then to have the modern pressures applied to them. I do want to drill down into this thing where the shoots, they kind of have this image that they're a king, and if the world would only see them as they are, they would make them a king. What is that about?
Well, maybe it's because they are so isolated and so lonely. They're trying to, somehow make themselves greater. They certainly want to stand out from the crowd. I mean, let's face it, a lot of the publicity, some of them mentioned that everyone's going to hear about me, everyone's going to know me, this has been written. And, we ought to take that seriously. There is some kind of delusions of grandeur in the background, but we also need to look at the connection between the school and the shooter. Statistics show that 43% of the time, Mark, the shooter was a current student at the school. Now, 20%, there's no connection, but by almost a 3-to-1 margin, the violence was targeted rather than random. So what's going on in those school environments?
I think that there's two elements there. The first one being we live in such an age where instead of a child wanting to grow up, I want to be an engineer, I want to be a train driver. I want to be a YouTuber, I want to be famous. And there's this quest for fame, and it's almost as though all the media.
Let me just interject. I really do think it has something to do with the social media platforms, because kids start comparing. How many followers do you have? How many people are liking your posts? And it becomes kind of a competitive thing rather than just something to openly share and information on.
Yeah, they seem to think that the kind of social media interaction they get is a measure of their value. Now, the second point I want to bring up is the one that you talked about with schools there. And I think it's quite telling that most of these people, as you say, it's 40+%, have current students at the school, but they don't appear unhinged in a way that shows they're unable to grasp reality. I mean, almost all these attacks, they take place in gun-free zones. And the schools where they go are gun-free zones, which I figure demonstrates that they have made a certain reasoned plan. And surely this fact alone supports the idea that if we want to protect schools, we need trained, tested, armed people there to stop these glory seekers as they are.
Well, for sure. I mean, if you were a gunman, you had a choice to go into an inner city school, which has, security guards, it's got metal detectors, or to go into a nice little safe suburban community where, it's a gun-free school zone and there's likely nobody, paying attention. Which one would you shoot up? But again, if 43% of them are happening in schools that are correlated to the shooter, we should look at that educational environment. Are these people just slipping through the cracks? Is anybody paying attention?
Yeah, we always hear about the red flags that went up beforehand, and they've got these social media posts where they're saying they're going to do something, or they've with this latest one where the boy filmed himself with a bag of dead cats, and nobody seemed to realize that this is a marker. I mean, surely this came through at some point in his school career and education.
Well, yeah, I mean,
there was something wrong.
You're right. This deranged behavior is just being passed by. Like I said, you can kind of see it on the bodies of some of these kids. And as I mentioned in our previous segment, there are nihilistic tendencies with these kids. 86% of these shooters died in the attack, and many of them suicidal.
Yeah, it's almost like I believe it's called death by cop. Is they want to get themselves in a position where they can gain the fame, the notoriety, but never have to deal with the consequences of what they've done, either emotionally, physically, or in a grander scheme of thing. Now, let's jump on to the topic of guns in general. Why do you think the gun debate in America can't seem to move beyond the tool involved? I mean, we've just discussed the psyche, the markers that we've seen with these disturbed young men. But the media and politicians, they can't move beyond the idea that guns are to blame. I mean, a firearm, it's just a tool like any other, can be used for good or bad. Just for an example here, in Europe, where guns are far harder to get than in the United States, we have a knife crime epidemic.
Well, again, I think it's an easy target, excuse the pun. And, we have myriad laws on the books, Mark, about gun control. There's just a mountain of things that you have to go through in a lot of states concerning concealed carry. Look, gun rights are really an issue for the left, and they're using this as a wedge. It doesn't really make logical sense, because if you look at the numbers, like you said, this last guy, Crimo or whatever
Robert Crimo,
Crimo, they went to his house and they took away umpteen knives. So anything can be used as a weapon. It just so happens that, the AR-15 is the weapon of choice, and so it's easy to demonize the weapon rather than, nobody wants to demonize the person. Nobody wants to demonize, certainly, a teenager. But you have to look at what is causing this behavior, what's going on in these environments. Are there some psychiatric medications that, like as I alluded to in your last segment with selective serotonin uptake inhibitors? These are all factors that need to be dialed into and looked at if we really want to responsibly take on this issue of school shootings.
One final question for you, Lisa, that leads off from that. Do you think part of the reason that people aren't willing to look into all of these myriad reasons, SSRIs, unhappy home lives, poor education things, could it be because that nobody wants to admit that years of pushing divisive, cognitive dissonance inducing, progressive ideas has led to an overall unhealthy psyche for America's youth?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, let's face it, there's culture rot in this society. You look at the games, the television shows, the movies, everything. It all spirals down from there. And if you're growing a crop of young people who don't even care if they live, that their own future is not worth saving, you can bet your bottom dollar that they're not going to care whether yours is either.
Lisa K. Donner, thank you ever so much.
You're welcome, Mark.
You're listening to Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network from our flagship station in the nation's capital, WWRC in Washington, D.C. And remember, you can tune in for Liberty Nation on KSRM 920 AM and 92.5 FM out of Kenai, Alaska. Later on, we talk Supreme Court impeachment with Scott Cosenza. But up next, after this short break, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris seem to have a failure to communicate. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
We often talk about political messaging, how one candidate failed to get their message across or how another hit the nail on the head with his or her messaging. But what happens when the government's two top dogs seem incapable of delivering even basic responses? Now, author Graham J. Noble recently wrote on just this topic on the pages of libertynation.com, and he joins us here today. Thanks for being here, Graham.
Good to be here, Mark.
So we have the president and the vice president, and neither seem capable of delivering a coherent message or even a strategy. What's going on? Where are the adults in the room?
I think what it comes down to is a deep-seated problem or a deep-seated phenomenon that is taking place with this administration. I believe for the first time in American history, we have a situation whereby the folks in DC, particularly in the White House, they're no longer concerned with what is in the best interests of the American people because they are so focused upon radical change, changing all of America's institutions, tearing them down basically and rebuilding them in a completely different image. And I think that's never happened before. I think every administration in the past, whether it's been Republican or Democrat, you know, we all know that career politicians like to try to avoid answering questions, but at least previously they've always, if they've given public remarks or they're in an interview answering questions or in a press conference, they will at least claim that they are working in the best interest of the American people, helping working families, protecting American jobs, protecting American workers, you know, keeping us all safe. They'll at least say that, even if you want to believe that that's not actually what they're about. They all say that. But this administration is almost literally, their message to us is, we don't care how hard life is for you because we are just pursuing a different agenda.
I guess what you're alluding to with the different agenda there is, for example, what the World Economic Forum's recently been talking about, how we need gas prices to get higher so that way we can transition to a green energy environment and electric cars. Mm-hmm. And I think you're right there that it's indefensible for Harris and Biden to say what they haven't campaigned on. And in this case, they seem to be fulfilling a World Economic Forum agenda, or let's be fair, a more globalist or internationalist agenda that they haven't presented to the American people. And that's why we're getting such a friction between the people and between the government at hand, which I think is reflected in the polling numbers, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you know, the polling numbers are obviously terrible for Mr. Biden right now. I think his approval number is somewhere in the high 20s, mid 20s, high 20s.
Yes, so there have been a couple of polls that put him in the high 20s, 29 or so. I think an aggregate is more around 33, 34. But that's terrible. That's a disaster.
Yeah, it is. You know, I don't know. I think I'd like to meet some of those 20-something% of people and have a drink with them, because I'm sure I could easily con them into paying my bar tab.
Yeah, they do seem easily pleased, don't they? And you and I discussed this before, Graham, but the wrong direction, right track figures are just as shocking, if not more so. There's 12% of the American public believe that the country is headed in the right direction. And 80+% people believe it's on the wrong track. And so how do they square this circle of, we claim to be doing this for you, for the people, and yet the vast majority of people think the country's going in the wrong direction? And remember, who's the driver? Who's the person steering the direction? Well, it's the president and the vice president. How do they square that?
You know, that's a good question, of course. And I think my answer to you, Mark, is that they're not interested in squaring that. I mean, just recently, I think possibly even as recently as yesterday, our new White House press secretary, Karine Jean-Pierre, was asked about the polling numbers and how the White House felt about it. And I believe her exact words are, "We're not going to pay attention to the polls," as if she was saying, well, the White House's position is, we don't actually care about public opinion. We're just going to carry on doing what we're doing.
You know, that position actually makes a lot of sense for them, because when you look at what's happening in the media, you have an activist media, fourth estate. The majority of the fourth estate is very left-leaning. And they seem willing to craft any narrative that would support Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, and Democrats in general.
Yeah.
But if we have a look at the Gallup poll, the most recent Gallup poll, that shows that only 16% of Americans have confidence in the nation's newspapers and news outlets. And that's down 5% from last year, which is a huge number. Do you think this drop is due to the fourth estate's unofficial campaigning on behalf of Democrats?
Yeah, I think it's got to be, really. I think there's a direct correlation between that kind of trust in media number and Mr. Biden's approval ratings and that right direction, wrong track polls. Because obviously, when you've got that larger percentage of Americans who disapprove of what Mr. Biden is doing and think the country, and that larger percentage of Americans who say the country is on the wrong track, well, then when you still have a media that is largely pretending that everything is fine and dandy, and and life is great, and essentially these media outlets are saying to the American people, what on earth are you complaining about? You've never had it so good. That kind of explains the reason for the enormous distrust in the media.
Coming back to what you said originally, that they're looking at a sort of another agenda, a sub-agenda to what's happening in policy. But there are occasions when they have to address things, Biden has to have to address things that aren't based on their policy platform, such as, for example, if there's a shooting or if there's a news event that happens that they must react to. And even here, they have difficulties. And could that be because they don't really believe in anything except the will to hang on to power?
Well, to address that particular issue, yes, I do happen to believe that's the same. I believe that Joe Biden himself, as proven by a study of his 4 or 5 decades, whatever it is, in public office, shows that he has changed his stance on almost every single major issue. But his problem when it comes to verbal communication, I believe, is one of this seemingly apparent cognitive decline that he is suffering. Misreading the teleprompter, memory lapses, getting dates wrong. Just yesterday, he said that the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas high school shooting occurred in 1918, and I thought to myself, well, that must have been how World War I ended then. I'm not saying these things to make fun of the guy. I'm just saying that these things actually happened, and they are a concerning sign of a declining physical and mental condition. Now, when it comes to Kamala Harris, different issue altogether. And I guess the way I would explain her problem is by saying to you, Mark, that there comes a time when we all have to be aware of the words that are coming out of our mouths. And when those words come out in certain orders, they form sentences, and those sentences are supposed to mean something. So we should be aware of that. Now, you're probably thinking, what the hell did Graham just say to me? Well, I wasn't actually trying to answer your question. I was giving you an example of how Kamala Harris answers every question. Now, why does she do it like this? 2 possibilities. Number one, she hasn't done her homework. She hasn't read her briefings. She hasn't listened to her aides. And therefore, she literally is not equipped with the facts. And so she just waffles. Or the other possibility is that she simply does not want to provide any information at all. She doesn't want to describe the actual measures that the administration is taking on any particular issue. And this is her very unconvincing way of simply avoiding giving a straight answer.
Graham J. Noble, thank you very much. End quote, repeat line.
Thanks, Mark.
Coming up after this short break, we're back with Scott DeSantis discussing the blatant attempt to recraft the Supreme Court as a machine for the political left. Don't touch that dial. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Democrat Representatives Ted Lieu and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez have called for action against the illegitimacy of the Supreme Court, stating that at least 2 Trump-nominated justices lied about their positions on Roe v. Wade during their confirmation hearings. A serious charge or just more partisan nonsense? Well, to figure that out, we're joined by Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor and constitutional attorney to boot, Mr. Scott DeSantis. Welcome back, Scott.
Thanks, Mark. Pleasure to be here.
So, Scott, let's start with the basics on this. What are Representatives Lieu and Ocasio-Cortez alleging?
Well, they don't so much as allege as they state. We look at the letter they jointly signed. They say that at least 2 justices directly lied to senators. That's a quote from the letter. So it's an allegation of perjury before the Senate Judiciary Committee, to be sure.
So they asked Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer to acknowledge that the justices lied, and then presumably that would be then to take action of impeachment after Senator Schumer says that they lied. Now, what's the process here in terms of rules and regulations? And will Schumer's condemnation really be worth anything?
Well, this is the proper form. As we know, how the Constitution instructs members of the House of Representatives is to address the Senate Majority Leader with letters sent via the post to get his opinion on something and ask for a ruling, and then they can act. Oh, wait.
That's an extra 6.5 cents, by the way.
I'm sorry, Mark.
On their postage there, Scott.
That's not how the Constitution says to do things.
Right,
it's
okay.
just a made-up political process by Ms. Ocasio-Cortez and Mr. Liu. They're members of Congress, Mark. I write letters to congresspersons when I want them to do something. They're members of Congress. The proper form is for them to introduce articles of impeachment into the House of Representatives, if that's what they think is the appropriate action. It boggles the mind, except to say that it seems like the only, and I've racked my brain for an answer that doesn't have to do with electoral politics or fundraising, which are seemingly the only answers that I can gather as to why those two members of Congress have chosen to ask a member of the Senate for some opinion statement. It's baffling unless we think of it as political theater, in which case perhaps it makes sense. Although it only makes sense for people who don't understand, I think, have an in-depth understanding of our political process, because then they would come to the same question, which is why are these members of Congress putting it on Chuck Schumer, a member of the U.S. Senate, to do something about it?
Well, yeah, I think a knowledge of how the Constitution works is not something with which Representatives Ocasio-Cortez and Ted Lieu have ever been accused, either fairly or unfairly. So let's get to the brass tacks.
Let me just stop you right there and just say that there are only a few things that the House of Representatives can do that the Senate doesn't. So many times, or perhaps even mostly, our legislation occurs in either one of those houses of Congress, and then there's a reconciliation committee or joint committee to resolve differences in the way a bill maybe have passed the Senate versus the House, and then that compromise reconciliation bill is sent through to make sure that both houses agree on the same language. But that's not true. We don't have that with spending bills and bills of impeachment, which must originate in the House. So it's so funny that the Constitution curves out the House for some very specific things. It's the people's house. It's closest to the people, and they have to do certain things themselves without the Senate. And one of them is impeaching. Yet somehow in that very specific thing, they don't want to take on the responsibility, but shift it to Leader Schumer.
Well, as you say, Scott, it certainly does smack of political theater. But really, is this just some kind of pretense to get public support for packing the court with justices that are perhaps more to the liking of Representatives Liu and Ocasio-Cortez?
It's tough to say, Mark. I think that both of those congresspersons have demonstrated their support for adding justices to the court, for packing the court, but also when you think of the fundraising benefits that they get from these sorts of things, being able to go back and say, I'm your champion, or for AOC to kind of maybe succeed in her district. All both these congresspersons are running for re-election in November. So there's electoral politics, not just party politics writ large, but literally the mechanics of how does AOC get back into Congress, right? So there's that to figure out too. So the answer to your question is, I don't know. There could be many, justifications in their minds for doing so, but we don't know. One thing is for sure, though, it's not the regular order for how to impeach somebody that they believe has lied before the Congress.
Well, actually, I want to dig into that a little bit. So let's say they actually had read the Constitution and understood the rule book for the roles for which they're being very well fiscally rewarded, which of course they haven't. But let's assume that they had for a moment, and they brought up some articles of impeachment within the House. What would happen then? What's the process?
Well, we saw Donald Trump was impeached twice by the House of Representatives. There's a bill of impeachment, just like other legislation that goes forward. They can hold hearings and take a vote, and then if they vote to impeach, they send that bill of impeachment over to the Senate, where there would be a trial for removal. It's the same process as for President of the United States as it would be for an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, and that's how you toss them out.
Great. So it's exactly the same as how it works with the president.
Yes.
But what I want to know here is, so it's a straight majority in the House. In the Senate, straight majority or 60?
2/3 vote of the Senate's required, Mark.
Okay, so realistically, this has absolutely no chance of getting through, because let's be fair, let's look at the ramifications of what would happen if the two congresspersons went
I think
ahead.
that the form, Mark, dictates what you're saying. We know that it doesn't have a chance to get through, because if it was, they would be rushing to file that bill of impeachment in the House themselves instead of rushing to send Leader Schumer a letter and then posting
through
it
through the post.
That's if they even
the
sent it at all,
thing.
by the way. They may just have posted it to Twitter. We're not sure if it was actually mailed.
Well, I mean, Twitter is obviously more important than real life. So I think it's really important to address the validity of the representative's argument. Because now I read that letter and you read that letter, and they quoted the justices directly, Justices Kavanaugh and Gorsuch.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not a legal scholar, Scott, as you well know. I am not a legal scholar.
Yeah.
But it seems to me, from a plain reading of the actual text that they quoted to condemn the two justices, it didn't seem like they said anything wrong. This is kind of the answers that I would expect somebody to answer.
I think that your mistake there is to think of these things legally rather than politically. So if we think of them legally under what we consider notions of perjury or lying to a court, clearly that's not the case. But if we think of politically, then yes, because that helps AOC and the Democrats. And so that's, if you just reframe your thinking about it and what words mean, then you'll come to a conclusion that meshes with the AOC and squad. I thought,
which communist dictator was it who said it doesn't matter if it's correct, it's whether it's politically correct that matters.
Yeah. When they started calling out these charges of perjury for Kavanaugh, I think is the first I heard about it, and then Gorsuch, I actually went back and listened to their confirmation hearings, and I couldn't find anything that they sort of could hang their hat on for any kind of perjury. And I just thought I was missing whatever statements they were. So I'm so glad within the letter. You have to think, if you're going to publish this letter to the public and send it to Leader Schumer, these are the most egregious examples, right? In other words, there are two quotes listed, one for each of the justices for how they quote unquote perjured themselves, but yet no perjury seems present. They're talking about the precedent of Roe v. Wade, and that they agree that those are precedents, just like any other precedent of the court. They never promised to not overturn Roe v. Wade, and they never promised that they would vote in any manner. So you're right to say that it doesn't seem like there's perjury here, Mark. That's just because there's not. There's absolutely no statement of fact that is untrue. And that's the hallmark of a civil libel or defamation suit. The hallmark of a bad one is they never actually mention the specific lie or misstatement that was, they just throw out a lot of flowery language about this is outrageous and it's not okay. And, you read the complaint and you think, well, what's the actual false statement alleged? And often it's not there because people just want to make a lot of noise. And these statements that AOC and Mr. Liu have identified as perjurious just seem not to be on any plain reading of the facts.
It's the drumbeat of Capitol Hill. Scott DeCosenza, thank you ever so much.
Thanks, Mark.
And that's almost it for this edition of Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I'd like to thank our guests, Lisa K. Donna, Graham J. Noble, Scott DeCosenza, and of course, you, the listener, for being here. My parting shot this week, Bertrand Russell. He once wrote that in all affairs, it's a healthy thing now and then to hang a question mark on the things that you have long taken for granted. Now, this could very well be the calling card of the modern left, who seek every opportunity to change the structure of society, the ways we interact, and the language that we're permitted to use. But Russell was a smart thinker. He meant it for deeper questions also, more so than just mere administration of life. He did not suggest that we should abandon our beliefs, but rather that we should examine them. And this is important. If we don't examine our rationale, our arguments, our beliefs, then we become stagnant in our application of principles and values. Be refreshed, be renewed in your beliefs, and you'll be all the more formidable for it. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
We're doing it for real, really real. Liberty Nation.
And Jeff Charles, contributor for LibertyNation.com.
I think we're starting to make an impact. Liberty style, fighting for freedom.
Daily tracking poll sponsored by Liberty Nation for Thursday.
Mentioned by Dan Bongino, Rasmussen, Jordan Peterson, and
I
others.
can do it again if you want me to.
Cited in Mark Levin's American Marxism.
I think we're starting to make a really big impact. Get noticed. We're doing it. Rock on. I'm gone.